Hi, Culminators. You know, you're getting tired of hearing me tell you how excited I am about the various guests, but Adrian Vermeule, ladies and gentlemen, the irascible, impossible, truly unique thinker, Adrian Vermeule, who you love and appreciate, and in many cases scorn and excoriate on Twitter because of his unique views. Even if you're a conservative or a certain kind of conservative, Adrian, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, Ron.
So for those of you who may not know, Adrian is a professor at the Harvard Law School, and he writes stuff, as law professors will do. This is one of the stuffs he has written fairly recently. And what the unique perspective that Adrian brings to the table, and it will be relevant to our conversation and to the overall topic of censorship, cancel culture, putative topic. Anyway, what Adrian's hypothesis is, as you can see, well, I'm not going to make you read the book review, but Adrian has taken the position that there's been an evolution away from the role of the courts as a policy-making institution towards the administrative state, towards agencies, towards specialized government workers who are specialized, and that's actually quite natural. It's quite appropriate. It's what the Constitution intended, and he's got a little bit of heat for that. Some praise as well, because as someone who used to do a lot of intellectual property work, this is still part of the introduction, Adrian. You do get to talk on my podcast.
No worries. I'm learning. Yeah.
There's a famous quotation from Judge Learned Hand, which I should have had prepared here, about how preposterous. Well, no, I'm not even. Yes, it was Judge Learned Hand. That it was about 80 years ago. How preposterous it was to assume that just because someone has been appointed to the federal bench by the President of the United States, confirmed by the Senate, that he is qualified to judge patent cases. You have to be basically in order to be admitted to the patent bar, you have to have a science degree or science background, and yet judges are making these multi-billion-dollar decisions with no such requirement whatsoever. So that would seem to be right in line with the thrust of your administrative law point. No?
Yeah, I put things this way, I suppose. Well, first of all, the book you put up is sort of 2 books ago, so I have to
you got to update it. Yes,
reload it in my mind.
But you'll see how I'm going to.
Okay, good. Yeah. I think the thrust of the book is just this: that our written Constitution and our small c Constitution, in the older sense, that is the basic institutional arrangements of the American polity, have come apart to some degree. Our actual operating small c Constitution is an administrative state, and it's here to stay whether we like it or not. And I think that has a lot of implications for people who think of themselves as not progressive, call them conservative if you like. It has implications for what they ought to do and how they ought to orient themselves in America 2021. So some of my libertarian colleagues in the law professor world want to abolish or substantially roll back the administrative state. And I don't think they can. I think that for non-progressives, the aim should be to orient the administrative state and steer it towards the common good. And that is really the subject of my upcoming book on common good constitutionalism.
All
So
right,
that's the basic idea. Yeah.
but would it be fair to say that in your more recent book, and I'm going to skip over the risk book, in your more recent book, that The Law and Limits of Reason, that you begin to move in that direction?
Yeah, I think that's fair. That is the more recent book is one I did called Law and Leviathan: Redeeming the Administrative
Oh,
State.
that's right.
And that
That's
is
right.
the one that really it's there on the right. Yeah, that is the one that really, I think, starts to develop this theme.
What I want to get to, though, is to now switch around, and I do think I'm going to end up bringing it all together. So here we are in this sort of post-judicial world, quasi-post-judicial world. And we're handing things off to administrations, to administrators. And at the same time, we're seeing that private institutions are that we're also handing off the job of censorship of public discourse to private institutions such as academia and corporations. Does it seem to you that we're in danger of not only making courts irrelevant, but making things like the constitutional guarantees of free speech irrelevant?
So I have a somewhat different, well, to be fair, a radically different take on free speech. And I think of it as the view of free speech that was absolutely standard in the classical legal tradition until shockingly recently, until really the 1970s, when the Supreme Court embarked on a kind of libertarian account of free speech. And the classical view, which is very much the view of the founders, and any self-respecting originalist, in my view, should adopt it. The classical view is that the public authorities have a legitimate function in promoting peace, order, and public morals, and can regulate speech to that end. So the classical view was that people have a right to speak in kind of publicly useful ways. They could speak, they can criticize the government, absolutely.
Well, there's political speech, classic political speech.
Exactly. But there was no idea that the government couldn't ban pornography or couldn't regulate things that the Supreme Court has made unregulable today. The example that really gets to me, and I talk about it in my forthcoming book at some length, is a case called Ashcroft versus Free Speech Coalition, in which the Supreme Court said that, I'm going to simplify greatly, but the Supreme Court said that the Congress couldn't ban the production of virtual child pornography by computer-generated images. And that seems to me a radical departure from the whole Western legal tradition. The idea that, as Justice Kennedy, maybe my least favorite justice, wrote for the court, well, no actual children are harmed in the production of computer-generated child pornography, so this is an attempt to suppress speech based on its content without any harm justification. And that seems to me almost lunatic. Yeah.
The premise of anti-pornography regulation has never been harm to those involved in it, or that they were necessarily even reality-based at all. Lady Chatterley's Lover was a work of fiction. Nobody, right. No animals or people were harmed in the authorship or publication of that of that novel. But I'm not saying that that is the appropriate level of censorship. I'm not saying that it's not. But
Yeah,
for him to make that, and for the court to get on board with this idea that no harm, no foul, there is really nothing left of pornography law in this country anymore, is there?
exactly. And one wonders what we've come to, where our supposedly leading judges struggle even to understand the idea that pornography might corrode the public morals of the whole community. It's not that they exactly think that's wrong, it's that they don't even understand it. They have some kind of conceptual framework that prevents them from even seeing it. But the evidence of it is all around us. And that, to my mind, is what we've got to work on.
So pornography has the advantage of being an easy case for people who believe, as you do and I happen to, that it is appropriate for a society to, and for a legal system to take that interest. And which I think that belief was baked into First Amendment jurisprudence until that case. Let's move off pornography, though, because for some reason it's a special case. And now let's get into the political censorship.
Yeah.
And because it is 2021 and everything's political. Everything's political. So your opinion or my opinion on how an election was conducted is political. What is an appropriate medical treatment or medication or policy regarding medication for a medical condition is political. So let me take a step back. We're involved in a case in which we are suing the state of California, Secretary of State of the state of California, and Twitter, and a whole bunch of other related parties for conspiring to remove the Twitter account of a guy named Rogan O'Handley, who's known as DC Drano. He has 2 million followers on Instagram. And he made an untoward characterization of California election security a week after the election, but was flagged by this election security commissar, what is it? Not a ministry in the state of California, which then basically pressed a bell that rings at Twitter. And in 98% of the cases where that bell rang at Twitter, they took the action requested by the state government. So we're making the argument that Twitter is a state actor. It's not that important to us whether the court agrees with us on that, because the real point here is that regardless, I mean, it is important, but what's more important is that there's a gigantic problem with government outsourcing censorship, which is exactly what happened there.
Right.
What we find, and we had an excellent oral argument on this case a couple of weeks ago, and we feel that it went very well, but there are a lot, your books reflect, especially your administrative law work, I think a very, very healthy and meaningful dose of legal realism. In other words, you might like this idea of princes of the law, but as a practical matter, here's how it really happens. It really happens in the agencies. It really happens like this. Judges have been hypnotized by Section 230.
Right.
And I think this judge wasn't. But here you've got the agency, the California Election Security Bureau. And here you've got the corporate governance of Twitter, which is more powerful than most of the world's nation states. And here you've got the individual who is a user of Twitter, but not really a customer of Twitter. And then you've got the judiciary, which so far, especially in the Ninth Circuit, has tended really strongly to defer to corporate determinations
Right.
of what is appropriate, what's good First Amendment, you know, what their rights are under the First Amendment, what their rights are under Section 230. Is there a singularity going on here, you know, that you see based on the work that you've done on the topics that we're talking about that could, you know, in any way illuminate where we're going?
I think so. So I would relate this to a point you made earlier about corporate and university bureaucracies. And I would distinguish two questions. One is, what scope does the public authority have for regulating speech in the interests of peace, order, and public morals? A different question is the question of the confusion of public and private functions. And that to me is, in some ways, the more central problem of America 2021. That is that, as you said, so much governance has been outsourced to corporations that claim to be private entities when it suits them, but also claim a kind of public function in regulating the public square and the forum in which people express political views. I wrote a piece called Monstrous Government, and I drew on this classical lawyer who said that the real decay of a regime is when you have a multiplicity of tyrants who are quote unquote private and who are more powerful than the public authority and are not subject to control by the public authority. And that rings profoundly true to me about America today. That is, that our public square is being run in this ambiguous way by firms that don't have the public interest at heart.
And which under libertarian theory and under free market theory shouldn't. There's no reason that they should. No reason on earth that they should.
Absolutely.
So the libertarians are our problem on both of your prongs.
Yeah.
They, not, I want to say they, but I will say that every single one I've ever met seem to think that if it's a privately owned entity, you know, and obviously other people I've spoken to don't, including many conservatives, don't think this, but if it's a privately owned entity, we've got, and government's got nothing to say about it. Regardless of how, you know, whether you want to use your term of common good, and I'm going to get back to that in a minute, but regardless of the social effect on human lives in this country.
Right.
And when we say that, we start hearing it ourselves sounding like the old new left of our childhood, but there it is. Right. And on the other hand, we've got a movement that was raised on the National Review, like me, where you had at once, you had the famous, what was it called? Not dualism, the fusionism, which was that we're gonna, you know, Buckley, of course, was a very conservative Catholic, and certainly a friend of public morality as an appropriate government function, and at the same time, very libertarian oriented, certainly as to economics. And most of the very young people on the right now, the people who consider me their social media daddy, okay, they're reflexively libertarian, except perhaps on the issue of pro-life, which is kind of an interesting topic, which is beyond our scope today, I think. But they tend to be pretty agnostic on issues of sexual morality, and they, they talk a lot about liberty, but and they even talk about culture, but not too much about what defines the culture that they think should be preserved. And now it's 2021, and you have come out very strongly as in your common good and in your writings on the role of, to the extent it's not covered by common good, the role of a theological point of view
right
in public life, saying, hey, we've got to come down somewhere, and that means we have to start defining our terms. Is that possible in any meaningful way anymore?
I think it is. So I am a realist, not only in the sense you correctly identified, but also in the older sense that I think there really is an objective moral law, and that this is a foundational to the Western, to the Judeo-Christian tradition. And we can't abandon the idea that although people may disagree, there is truth. There's truth about what is in the common good, what promotes social flourishing and the flourishing of a polity. If we abandon that, we're done. So I think that what we need to do is recognize a couple things. First, that culture can't flourish without the protection and promotion of a healthy culture by public authority. So culture can't flourish in a polity in which the public authority is in some way diseased or fractured, as we've discussed. And the second thing is that the autonomy can no longer be the kind of watchword of our political order. That is, we've got to get beyond the idea that the only function of public authority is to maximize the liberty of each, subject to the like liberty of all, that kind of thing. We've thought that for 2 generations now, and I think it's created a disastrous environment in which people are hurting themselves and hurting the social fabric through, well, you know all the problems. So I do think that we need to reassert an objective moral order, and we need to reassert it through public authority. And that's why I'm not a libertarian in any way.
So we have a state of affairs where we not only have this sort of atomism,
Yeah,
which is championed as individualism,
right.
so, and as Orthodox religionists, we know, you and I, and those who think like us, that the individual is not the be all and end all. There's an extraordinary significance to each and every human life and the dignity of every human life, but only when appreciated as part of God's creation.
Exactly.
So what we have, though, of course, is another knee-jerk inclination within our culture, including among the most sophisticated, which is who will define, who and how will we define what that common good is? If it's, and is it going to be is it a theological definition? And this came up rather surprisingly in the main school choice case a couple of weeks ago, where the justices started asking, what is a religion? What is a set of values? What does the First Amendment actually prohibit a school from teaching. When we say that we're going to reassert non-individualistic values, and you talk about common good, are we not? How do you respond to the criticism that says, well, that's just a mirror image of totalitarianism, that individuals don't count, but rather the people count, the proletariat counts, something like that. What's the response?
So the classical tradition of the common good has been always and everywhere an enemy of totalitarianism. It was an enemy of, for example, Nazism and fascism in the middle of the 20th century. And the reason is that the common good tradition does not think that the aim of government is to simply sacrifice or override individual well-being in the interests of some aggregate collective. It says rather that life in a flourishing polity, where flourishing is defined according to the objective moral law, is itself best for individuals, and that such a flourishing polity itself includes respect for things like the family, things like the individual conscience within the bounds of public morality and public order. So it incorporates within it respect for human dignity, which is a foundational principle both of Catholic theology and of Jewish theology, in my imperfect understanding of it. And so there is no claim that we want to subsume the individual in a mass. What we want to do is simply to understand that the individual cannot live a dignified life unless the polity is also flourishing according to the moral law. When we have a polity that isn't flourishing according to the moral law, we have individuals suffering, we have them overdosing on fentanyl, we have them jobless, we have them living lives distorted and warped by pornography, by these other symptoms of social breakdown, suicide. America 2021 is a country in which life expectancy has been declining for multiple years in a row, which is basically unheard of in advanced nations. Something's very wrong, and I don't think we don't need to get into elaborate discussions about the differences, for example, between Catholic and Jewish theology at this point, because
Right.
America 2021 is so far from anything that's healthy that our common ground is much greater than any disagreements we could possibly have, if that makes any sense.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, isn't it basically what most even non-religious, but nonetheless traditionally oriented people would think of as traditional morality, the sort of basic moral standards that were in place in the middle of the 20th century, in the 50s, but without necessarily the acceptance of bigotry that was, still much more common then.
That's right. I mean, I'd put it this way: the natural law is accessible to the reason of all mankind. You don't have to be expressly Catholic or anything else to understand the kind of core components of the natural law. And we're so far from those core values or components that the stuff about theological sectarianism is usually offered in bad faith. It's usually offered by people who want to create divisions that don't exist under current circumstances, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense, especially when you come from the point of view of Catholicism, which is always a convenient whipping boy in American liberal politics.
Right.
I mean, to think that in the 21st century, judicial nominees are being asked about the influence of the Vatican, on their judicial philosophy. And I mean, it's Al Smith is rolling in his grave. He died for nothing. It's just unbelievable. I suppose then the question is, first of all, I'm going to ask you, if you can, I'm sure since you've spoken on this so many times, when do we, you refer to the common good tradition. Is that something that goes back to scholasticism? Is it something that goes back to is it an early 20th century conception? What?
Oh no, it's the mainstream of the Western legal tradition.
Going back to Roman law.
It incorporates Roman law, which itself incorporates, after the Romans become Christian, their law incorporates both elements of the law of the Old Testament and of the New Testament, and combines it with pagan Roman law. And we get this very rich thing called the jus commune, which is the kind of mainstream of the Western legal tradition. And one of my points is that this is our tradition until shockingly recently. So it's something that exists in our law well into the 20th century. It's participated in by Catholic justices, Protestant justices, Jewish justices like Brandeis and Cardozo, who had a classical education. And it's really not until after World War II, and especially the 1960s and 1970s, that it starts to break down into this kind of libertarian and positivist view that rejects, in some cases, the existence of the natural law.
But aren't you sort of a positivist yourself? You have you've also written about how legislatures are essentially, by virtue of their diverse makeup even in a representative democracy, have this sort of self-correcting tendency. Now, how does that jibe with the administrative state as?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, because many people who are positivists think that legislative codes are the be all and end all, but I'm not a fan of legislatures on positivist grounds. That is, the classical tradition said that among the principles of political morality is what we might call role morality. That is the idea that judges don't decide everything, that there is a scope for legislatures to make the natural law more specific and sort of bring it down to the ground. So the natural law might say something like, well, you shouldn't be able to sue someone, decades after the fact, but you need a legislature to make that more specific and create a statute of limitations for specific offenses, that kind of thing. So legislatures have an important role to play, but precisely because we entrust them with promoting public morals and promoting this flourishing order of the common good.
If we've lost the way in the last 40 or 50 years, not only in our precedents, but also in the culture.
Yeah.
If we were somehow, you and I, able to wave a magic wand and get all the judges to see the light on this,
yes,
where would they go to base their decisions on not to base it, but rather to frame it in a common good approach as you advocate?
Yeah, so this is one of my, I guess, running disagreements with the people you described as the fusionists or the kind of national review crowd. So I believe that there is a powerful role in any legal system, and in our legal system, for elite influence. That is, for people with the right views to make decisions, both judicial and executive, legislative, that themselves shape and influence the culture. And we've seen that over and over again. The progressives are very good at this. They have no embarrassment about this. They decide a case like Obergefell, and then within a few years, everybody agrees because they understand that the law is a teacher and it has this influence on the culture. So I think that is the way forward for us. The details I'll just say are in my forthcoming book, but some of the examples are recasting free speech law to allow much more scope for the regulation along classical lines. Rethinking cases like the Bostock decision, which said that gender identity is sort of protected under Title VII and has subsequently been used by other courts, even to extrapolate constitutional rights of gender identity. And on the economic front, I am, this is where I think I become a little more like old left than new right or something. I'm very hospitable to government promoting a healthy natural environment. I think that's part of the flourishing of the political community. So there are all sorts of fronts on which we can move. But yeah, go ahead.
You've obviously read The Power Broker.
Robert Moses?
Right.
Oh yeah, I think I read it some time ago, like years ago. You have to refresh my. Yeah.
Well, he firmly believed, and after his education at Yale and Oxford, more firmly than ever, that everything should in fact be managed by the right men, men. And he was not a progressive. In fact, in many respects, he was quite a reactionary. And he single-handedly shaped New York, the entire New York metropolitan area, in immense ways, forever. And one of the criticisms, so in many respects, it seemed, there's always this problem of deciding who there's an accountability problem, for one thing. And secondly, look at our elites. What you mean by elites is not what they mean by elites at the New York Times and the Washington Post, who consider themselves the elites. It's the people who have educations like yours and mine, but not the views like yours and mine.
Right.
So those are the details. I think I don't think I need to necessarily get into your answer for the fine points of legal decisions and theological or moral distinctions, but I guess it's about building up a new cadre of elites.
There's no alternative to that. I don't think that there's ever been a time in American history when elites didn't have a profoundly outsized influence on what government does, on culture, on society. So the idea that because of the risk of elite abuse of power, we can somehow do something else is a kind of mistake.
And meanwhile, Harvard just dropped the SAT.
Right. Which, well,
may or may not be directly related, but it tells you where the quest for quality is moving.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why we need to, I think, proceed on two fronts towards the formation of a new elite. One is to be unashamed about using public authority to shape what the universities do. So I wrote a piece with a colleague of mine a few years ago about how a new administration should expressly use funding and other sticks and carrots to reshape and direct universities towards training elites with a different sort of view. And that should, in my view, be agenda item number one for the next conservative administration. The other thing we need to do is to form new institutions altogether. That is, to get out from under the grip of progressives on these institutions and to start new universities, start new programs, start new schools, ways of training elites that will not pay off immediately, but will pay off a generation from now.
And that's a trick. That's a really ambitious project. I'm going to say in our final couple of minutes here, because brands, elites are usually identified through the use of flags, because you can't. Well, I can't say you can't. In other countries, there are extensive skill and knowledge tests that are given to qualify for certain kinds of government work. For example, in the United States, there are civil service tests. But what we generally have is a Harvard degree, a Princeton degree. He's one of us. And brands, going back to my old emphasis on my work, brands are the flags in what gets recognized as elites by elites. So you have to some extent, that's happening with the creation of alternative media. And the conversation we're having right now isn't on PBS, and it never will be on PBS, but people who want to listen to it are free to download it or watch it on even YouTube. And that's become an acceptable form of discourse. So the opening is there.
Right. I think that the progressives are actually hurting themselves, but maybe this is wishful thinking, but I actually think that they are overconfident that their brand is eternal. And when they do things like eliminate the SATs, they create the possibility that other institutions that do select for actual merit, actual quality, will then suddenly become far more attractive to young people who can use that as a signal to employers and others that they are smart or they are learned or whatever. So I'm not so sure that the progressives are playing their hand well on that dimension.
I think they probably aren't. I think there is a medium and a long term on that can't be good for them. It's simple. At the end of the day, brand alone will only get you so far. You got to be able to deliver. And increasingly, what I am hearing from people in business is that they are having a great deal of trouble filling positions with truly qualified people because of the need to represent and diversify. And it's not doing anyone any favor to pretend, just like you would not put me in center field on the Yankees, not now and not 35 years ago, just because they don't have enough Orthodox Jewish baseball players in the Bronx. Similarly, ellipse. Adrian, thank you. I feel like I could do this all day, but it's not fair to anyone involved other than me if we did. So thank you very much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah. The honor's all mine. And when the new book comes out, keep us in mind.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot. Okay.
Take care.